The plate shattered against the wall before Eleanor Ashworth could even flinch. "No gentleman will ever desire you," her mother said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Look at you. 23 years old, unmarried, and still speaking your mind at the dinner table like a man. Do you think that is charming? Do you think that is what a husband wants?" Eleanor sat frozen in her chair, her hands pressed flat against the table to keep them from shaking. Around her, the candles flickered, as if even the flames wanted to shrink away from Margaret Ashworth's fury. Her younger sister Charlotte stared down at her plate, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Their father, gone 3 years now, was not there to soften the blow the way he once had. "I only said that Mr. Blackwood's opinions on the harvest tax seemed misinformed," Eleanor said quietly. "I meant no disrespect." "You meant no disrespect," Margaret repeated, mocking the words back at her. "You humiliated me in front of the one family that might still save us from ruin. Edmund Blackwood is the son of the wealthiest merchant in this county, and you chose tonight, of all nights, to argue with him about tax policy. He was wrong. It does not matter if he was wrong." Margaret's hand came down hard on the table, rattling the silverware. "It does not matter, Eleanor. A man like that does not want a wife who corrects him. He wants a wife who is quiet, who is pleasant, who makes him feel clever. You will never understand this because you have never once tried to be what a husband requires." The words landed like small stones, one after another, each one finding its mark. Eleanor had heard variations of this speech many times before, but tonight it felt different. Tonight there was something final in her mother's tone, as though a door was closing that could never again be opened. "We are 3 months from losing this house," Margaret continued, quieter now but no less cruel. 3 months, Eleanor. "Your father left us with debts I still do not fully understand, and the only path forward that I can see is a good marriage for you or for your sister. Charlotte is 16, she has time. You do not." Charlotte's fork stopped moving against her plate. "I am aware of our situation, Mother," Eleanor said, her voice steady even though her chest felt tight. "I read every letter from the solicitor. I know exactly how many months we have left." "Then act like it. Smile at Edmund Blackwood. Laugh at his jokes, even the ones that are not funny. Ask him about his father's shipping business and pretend you find it fascinating. Is that truly so difficult for you? It is difficult to pretend to admire a man who has no admirable qualities." Margaret's eyes narrowed. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the wind pressing against the windows. "You have always thought yourself above the rest of us," her mother said finally. "Above your sister, above the neighbors, above every decent match that has been offered to you. You believe some grand love is waiting for you somewhere out there in the world, the way it happens in the novels you hide under your bed. Let me tell you something, Eleanor. That is a fantasy for foolish girls. In the real world, a plain woman with a sharp tongue and no fortune does not get to choose. She takes what is offered, and she is grateful for it." The word plain hung in the air longer than the others. Eleanor had been called many things by her mother over the years, but there was something about hearing it stated so flatly, so certainly, as though it were simply a fact recorded in a ledger, that made her stomach turn. "May I be excused?" Eleanor asked. "No, you may not. We are not finished." But Eleanor was already rising from her chair. Charlotte reached out, as if to catch her sister's sleeve, but Eleanor moved too quickly, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "Sit down," Margaret commanded. "I need air. Eleanor Ashworth, if you walk out of this room." She did not hear the rest of the sentence. She was already in the hallway, already reaching for her shawl on the hook by the door, already pushing past the housekeeper who looked at her with quiet sympathy but said nothing. The front door swung open into the cool evening, and the night air hit her face like something almost kind. She walked without any particular direction, following the gravel path away from the house and toward the low stone wall that marked the edge of the Ashworth property. The moon was only a thin sliver above the trees, and the fields beyond the wall stretched dark and silent in every direction. Somewhere far off, an owl called once and then went quiet. Eleanor sat down on the cold stone wall and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her hands were still trembling, though whether from the cold or from her mother's words, she could not say. She thought of Edmund Blackwood, with his heavy jaw and his habit of speaking loudly about subjects he barely understood, and she felt a wave of something close to despair. Was this truly the future waiting for her? A lifetime spent nodding along to a man's opinions, biting her tongue, shrinking herself down until there was nothing left of the person she actually was? She thought too of her father, who had never once made her feel as though her intelligence was a flaw to be corrected. He had taught her to read Latin when she was 8 years old, had let her sit in his study while he reviewed the estate accounts, had told her once that a sharp mind was the rarest kind of beauty a person could possess. She missed him more in moments like this than at any funeral or anniversary. A gust of wind moved through the trees, and Eleanor pulled her knees up, resting her chin against them, staring out at the dark fields as though an answer might appear somewhere in the shadows. She did not cry. She had trained herself long ago not to cry in front of anyone, and some part of her extended that discipline even to moments when she was entirely alone, as if her mother's voice might still somehow hear it and use it as further proof of weakness. Instead, she thought about the future with a kind of cold, clear focus. 3 months, perhaps less, if the solicitor's warnings were to be believed. 3 months to somehow rescue her family from ruin, or to accept a marriage that would rescue them for her, at the cost of everything she had ever wanted for herself. She did not know, sitting there on the stone wall beneath the thin moon, that somewhere across the county, a young man was at that very moment folding a letter of his own, one that would eventually lead him down a dark and unfamiliar road, toward a broken-down carriage, and a woman he had never met. She did not know that her mother's cruel words, spoken in anger at a dinner table that would soon be forgotten by everyone except her, were about to become the most inaccurate prediction anyone in that county would ever make. For now, she only knew the cold of the stone beneath her, the ache behind her ribs, and the quiet, stubborn refusal in her heart that told her, despite everything her mother believed, that she was not finished yet. Whatever waited for her beyond these fields, beyond this house, beyond the narrow future being drawn up for her by people who did not understand her at all, she intended to meet it standing upright, not bent by anyone's cruelty. The owl called again in the distance. Eleanor rose from the wall, brushed the dust from her skirts, and walked back toward the house, back toward the warm candlelight and her mother's disapproval, carrying inside her a small, hard seed of resolve that she did not yet have a name for, but that would, within a matter of weeks, change the entire course of her life. Behind her, unnoticed in the darkness, a hawk moth drifted past the garden hedge and disappeared into the night, the same direction from which, before long, help would come riding. Inside the house, Margaret Ashworth stood at the drawing-room window, watching her daughter's shadow move back across the lawn, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She did not soften as Eleanor approached the door. If anything, her expression hardened further, as though she had used the walk to sharpen every argument she still intended to make that night. "You will apologize to Mr. Blackwood at the earliest opportunity," Margaret said the moment Eleanor stepped back inside, not waiting for the door to close behind her. "And you will be pleasant to him at Lady Fenwick's assembly next week, or I promise you, Eleanor, I will find a way to make your life here considerably more difficult than it already is. You have made yourself very clear, Mother." "Have I? Because I do not think you understand the seriousness of our position. I do not think you understand what it means to watch this house, your father's house, sold away to strangers because his daughter was too proud to smile at a man with money." Eleanor said nothing. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said, in one form or another, 100 times before. She climbed the stairs to her room, closed the door quietly, and sat by the window for a long while, watching the same dark fields she had just walked among, wondering how a single evening could hold so much anger and still leave room, somewhere underneath it, for a small and stubborn kind of hope. Down the hall, Charlotte lay awake in her own bed, having heard every word through the thin walls of the house, and made a private promise to herself that when it was her turn to sit at that dinner table under their mother's judgment, she would try to be braver than she felt right now, brave enough to speak for her sister when Eleanor could not speak for herself. None of them knew yet how soon that courage would be tested, or how far a determined man was willing to ride to prove a bitter woman entirely wrong. The carriage wheels snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and Eleanor was thrown hard against the side panel, as the whole vehicle lurched sideways into the ditch. "Whoa, whoa there," the coachman shouted, fighting to control the panicked horses as the carriage tipped at a sickening angle. Eleanor grabbed for the strap above the window, her heart pounding, the world outside a blur of dark trees and rushing wind. For one terrible second, she thought the entire carriage might roll. But the wheels caught in the soft mud of the ditch, and the vehicle groaned to a stop, tilted but upright. "Miss Ashworth, are you hurt?" The coachman, a weathered man named Silas who had worked for her family for over a decade, was already climbing down from his seat. "I am unharmed," Eleanor called back, though her voice shook more than she would have liked. She pushed open the door, which now hung at an awkward angle, and climbed out into the cold night air, her boots sinking slightly into the mud at the road's edge. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and she had been returning from visiting her aunt in the next village, a visit her mother had grudgingly permitted, only because Eleanor's aunt occasionally sent small sums of money that the family desperately needed. Now, standing on a dark and unfamiliar stretch of road with a broken carriage and 2 frightened horses, Eleanor felt the full weight of how alone they were. "The axles cracked clean through, miss," Silas said grimly, crouching beside the wheel with a lantern he had pulled from beneath his seat. "We're not going anywhere tonight. Not on this wheel. How far are we from home?" 6 miles. At least, maybe more, the way this road twists. Eleanor looked up and down the empty road. On either side, dense woods pressed close, their branches black against a sky just barely lit by a rising moon. There were no houses in sight, no lights, nothing but the sound of wind moving through the trees and the horses shifting nervously in their harnesses. "Can you ride one of the horses back for help?" she asked. "I could, miss, but I'm loath to leave you out here alone. Not on this road, not at this hour. There's talk of highwaymen working these parts, though I've never seen one myself." The word highwayman sent a small chill through Eleanor's chest, though she tried not to let it show. "Then what do you propose we do, Silas?" Before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats reached them from down the road, fast and steady, growing louder with each second. Silas straightened immediately, his hand moving to the small pistol he kept tucked beneath the driver's seat, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "Get behind me, miss," Silas said quietly. A single rider emerged from the darkness, his horse a tall black animal that moved with obvious strength even at speed. The rider slowed as he approached the wreckage of the carriage, taking in the scene with a single sweeping glance, before bringing his horse to a full stop several yards away. "Good evening," the rider called out, his voice calm, unhurried, entirely unlike what Eleanor had expected from a stranger appearing suddenly on a dark road. "It looks as though you've had some trouble." "We have managed well enough, sir," Silas replied, though he did not lower the hand resting near his pistol. "No need to trouble yourself." The rider dismounted smoothly, and as he stepped closer into the light of Silas's lantern, Eleanor got her first real look at him. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in fine but travel-worn clothing that suggested a long journey rather than a local errand. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from riding, and there was an easy confidence in the way he moved, the kind that came from a lifetime of never having to worry about being questioned or turned away. "I can see that," the stranger said, glancing at the cracked axle with a faint, wry smile. "You've managed so well that your carriage now rests in a ditch, and your horses look ready to bolt at the next strange noise. Forgive me, but I would not call that managing. I would call that an unfortunate accident that anyone with eyes could see requires assistance." Eleanor felt a flash of indignation despite the circumstances. "We are grateful for your concern, sir, but as you can see, we are not entirely helpless. My coachman was preparing to ride for help." The stranger's gaze shifted to her for the first time, and something in his expression changed, a flicker of genuine interest, replacing the polite condescension of a moment before. "And leave you here alone in the dark, on a road known for its less savory travelers? That seems an unwise plan, if you don't mind my saying so." "I did not ask your opinion of the plan." A short silence followed, and then, to Eleanor's surprise, the stranger laughed, a low and genuine sound that carried easily in the quiet night air. "No," he admitted, "you did not. My apologies. It seems I have a habit of offering opinions where none were requested. A flaw my sister reminds me of often." Despite herself, Eleanor felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. "Then perhaps you should listen to your sister." "I have tried. It has not taken." He gave a small, formal bow, though there was something playful in the gesture rather than stiff. "Regardless of my flaws, I would be glad to offer real assistance rather than opinions. My estate lies not far from here. less than 2 miles down this road. I can send one of my grooms back with a proper wagon to collect you. And in the meantime, you are welcome to wait somewhere warmer than a ditch." Silas looked at Eleanor, clearly leaving the decision to her, though his posture remained cautious. Eleanor studied the stranger for a long moment. There was nothing in his manner that suggested danger, only an odd, easy warmth that she was not accustomed to receiving from men she had just met. Most gentlemen she encountered treated her either with dismissive politeness or with the kind of forced enthusiasm that came from knowing her family needed a good match. This man seemed to look at her as though she were simply a person worth speaking to, nothing more calculated than that. "That is a generous offer from a stranger," she said carefully. "It is a practical offer from someone who does not care to leave two people stranded in the cold when a solution is close at hand," he replied. "Though if it eases your mind, I can tell you my name, so that I am somewhat less of a stranger. I am Julian." He did not offer a surname, and Eleanor noticed the omission, but chose not to press it. She had her own reasons for wanting to remain slightly anonymous herself, given the awkwardness of a young unmarried woman being found alone on a dark road at night, a fact that could easily be twisted into gossip if it reached the wrong ears. "Eleanor," she said simply, matching his choice. "Well, Eleanor," Julian said, testing the name as though it pleased him. "Shall we get you out of this wind before you catch a chill, or would you prefer to continue standing in a ditch on principle?" "I am not standing in the ditch." "No, but your carriage is, and it seems only a matter of time before you slide in after it." This time, Eleanor could not entirely suppress her smile. There was something disarming about his manner, a kind of easy humor that did not feel like flattery, only genuine amusement, as though he found the situation as absurd as she did. Silas, seeming somewhat reassured by the exchange, finally relaxed his stance. "If you're offering a wagon, sir, I'd be grateful for it. These horses won't hold steady much longer in this cold." Then it settled. Julian turned back to his own horse and retrieved a heavy woolen blanket from behind his saddle, which he offered to Eleanor without hesitation. "This should help until the wagon arrives. It is not elegant, but it is warm." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before accepting it, wrapping it around her shoulders over her shawl. The wool smelled faintly of horse and leather, and something else she couldn't quite name, something clean and unfamiliar. "Thank you." "You're welcome. Now, while we wait, perhaps you can settle a disagreement I've been having with myself for the better part of this ride." "What sort of disagreement?" "Whether the fastest route from here to Marchford crosses the old stone bridge or follows the river road. I favor the bridge, but my horse seems to have opinions of his own on the matter, and he keeps trying to pull toward the river." Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in conversation. "You are asking me for directions." "I am asking for your opinion, which I suspect is a good deal more reliable than my horse's." "The bridge is faster," she said slowly, still uncertain whether he was teasing her. "But it has been unsafe since the spring floods. Most people use the river road now, despite the extra time." Julian nodded thoughtfully, as though she had just confirmed something important. "There, my horse was right after all. I shall have to apologize to him. You speak to your horse as though he has feelings to be wounded." "He is a very sensitive animal. Are you always this skeptical of ordinary conversation, or have I simply said something particularly foolish tonight?" "Both, perhaps," Eleanor replied, and this time she did not try to hide her smile. They continued talking as they waited, the conversation moving easily from the state of the roads to the unusually cold autumn they were having, to a brief and surprisingly sharp exchange about a recent piece of political news that Eleanor had read in her father's old newspapers, an exchange in which Julian seemed genuinely delighted, rather than offended by her firm opinions. It was, Eleanor realized with some astonishment, one of the most enjoyable conversations she had had in longer than she could remember, made all the stranger by the fact that it was taking place beside a wrecked carriage on a dark and lonely road. When the wagon finally arrived, sent ahead by one of Julian's grooms, Eleanor found herself almost reluctant for the evening to end. Julian helped her up into the wagon with a steady hand, and as she settled onto the bench beside Silas, he looked up at her with an expression that was harder to read than his earlier easy humor, something quieter and more considering. "I hope your journey home is safe, Eleanor," he said. "Thank you, Julian, for your assistance tonight. I am in your debt." "Not at all. Though if you ever find yourself at Lady Fenwick's assembly next week, Perhaps you might allow me to collect on that debt with a dance instead." Eleanor felt a small jolt of surprise, followed quickly by a flicker of unease. Lady Fenwick's assembly was the very event her mother had been forcing her toward, the event where she was meant to smile prettily at Edmund Blackwood and secure her family's future through his interest. She had not expected to hear of it again so soon, and certainly not from the lips of a mysterious stranger she had met by accident on a broken road. "Perhaps," she said carefully, unwilling to commit to anything further. Julian smiled, apparently satisfied with the non-committal answer, and stepped back to let the wagon pull away. As they rolled down the dark road toward home, Eleanor glanced back once and saw him still standing there, watching the wagon go, his tall figure outlined against the moonlit trees, until a bend in the road finally carried him out of sight. She did not know his surname. She did not know his family, his fortune, or his true position in the world. Only that he had appeared out of the darkness at the exact moment she needed help, had treated her with a warmth and respect she rarely received, and had left her with a small, unfamiliar flutter of anticipation about an assembly she had, until that very evening, been dreading with her whole heart. Beside her, Silas said nothing, though he cast her a sideways glance and a faint, knowing smile that Eleanor pretended not to notice. The wagon rattled on through the darkness, carrying her home to a house full of debts and disapproval, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, some part of her was already looking forward to what the coming week might bring. She could not have guessed, wrapped in a borrowed blanket that still smelled faintly of leather and horse, that the man she had spoken with so freely on that dark road held a title that would make her mother's jaw drop, or that within days, the whole county would be whispering about the Duke of Harrogate and the mysterious young woman he had rescued from a broken carriage on the road to Marchford. The candlelight in Lady Fenwick's grand hall seemed almost too bright after weeks of dim evenings at home, and Eleanor's stomach twisted the moment she heard the name announced at the top of the staircase. His Grace, the Duke of Harrogate. The words rippled through the crowded ballroom, like a stone dropped into still water. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Fans stopped fluttering. A dozen mothers turned as one toward the staircase, their eyes suddenly sharp with calculation, while their unmarried daughters straightened their postures and adjusted their expressions into something more hopeful. Eleanor, standing near the refreshment table with a glass of lemonade she had not yet touched, felt the blood drain from her face. Julian. It could not be, and yet, as she turned to look, there he was, descending the staircase with the same easy confidence she remembered from the dark road a week earlier, dressed now in fine dark evening clothes that made him look every inch the aristocrat his title claimed him to be. His dark hair was neatly combed, his bearing composed, but his eyes swept the room in a manner that suggested he was searching for someone in particular. A duke, Eleanor whispered to herself, the word tasting strange and impossible in her mouth. He never said he was a duke. Beside her, Charlotte, who had been dragged along that evening as much for appearances as for her own introduction into society, followed her sister's gaze. "Do you know him, Eleanor? You've gone quite pale." "I do not know him," Eleanor said quickly, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were not entirely true. She knew the sound of his laugh. She knew that he spoke to his horse as though it had feelings. She knew the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was amused. She simply had not known that the man attached to all of these small, specific memories was one of the most powerful and eligible men in the entire county. Across the room, Margaret Ashworth had gone very still, her attention fixed entirely on the new arrival, calculating something behind her carefully composed expression. When she finally turned back to her daughters, there was a strange, hungry light in her eyes that Eleanor had never seen before. "A duke," Margaret murmured, almost to herself. "Unmarried, they say. Came into the title only 2 years past, when his elder brother passed. There has not been a duke of marrying age in this county in a generation." She turned sharply to Eleanor. "You will not embarrass me tonight. Do you understand? Whatever foolish opinions you may hold about tax policy or shipping or anything else under the sun, you will keep them to yourself in his presence. I have no intention of speaking to him at all, Mother. See that you do not. Edmund Blackwood is arriving within the hour, and you will devote your full attention to him, as we discussed." Eleanor said nothing, though her eyes drifted back across the ballroom to where Julian stood, now surrounded by a small crowd of eager acquaintances, all of them vying for a moment of his attention. She watched him nod politely, exchange pleasantries, and yet there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested he found the entire performance somewhat tiresome, a stark contrast to the relaxed, genuine warmth he had shown her on the dark road. For nearly an hour, Eleanor managed to avoid crossing paths with him, occupying herself with polite conversation among the other young women and enduring her mother's increasingly pointed glances toward the entrance, where Edmund Blackwood had not yet arrived. She told herself it was for the best. A duke would have no serious interest in a woman with no fortune and a family drowning in debt, regardless of how pleasant their conversation had been on a dark and lonely road. Whatever charm had passed between them that night had likely been nothing more than the easy friendliness of a man accustomed to putting strangers at ease, a skill that came naturally to those born into wealth and comfort. She was in the middle of convincing herself entirely of this theory, when a voice spoke close behind her. "There you are. I had begun to think I imagined our entire conversation on the Marchford Road." Eleanor turned sharply, nearly spilling her lemonade, to find Julian standing directly behind her, close enough that she caught the faint scent of cedar and leather that she remembered from the borrowed blanket. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a slightly too hasty curtsy. "I did not realize, that is, you did not mention, that I was a duke?" he finished for her, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "No, I suppose I did not. Would it have changed our conversation if I had?" "It might have changed my willingness to argue with you about tax policy on a public road. Then I am glad I withheld the information. It was, without question, the most honest conversation I have had with anyone in this county since I inherited the title. Most people I meet now seem far more interested in my rank than in my opinions, or theirs." Eleanor glanced around nervously, aware of the sudden attention their conversation was drawing from nearby guests, several of whom had stopped their own conversations entirely to watch. Her mother, she noticed with a sinking heart, was staring at them from across the room, with an expression caught somewhere between shock and dawning ambition. "Your Grace, I fear our conversation is attracting a great deal of notice." "It generally does, when I speak to anyone for longer than 30 seconds. I have found it a rather exhausting consequence of my position." He studied her for a moment, his expression growing more serious. "Does the attention trouble you?" "It troubles my mother a great deal more than it troubles me, though I suspect for very different reasons than you might imagine. I would be curious to hear those reasons, if you are ever inclined to share them." Before Eleanor could respond, a familiar and unwelcome voice interrupted from just behind her shoulder. "Miss Ashworth, there you are. I have been looking for you since the moment I arrived." Edmund Blackwood approached with the confident, heavy-footed stride of a man who had never once doubted his own welcome anywhere he went. He was broad-shouldered and well-dressed, his features pleasant enough in a bland sort of way, though his expression carried the particular smugness of someone who believed his father's fortune entitled him to whatever he desired. "Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor said, forcing politeness into her voice. "How good of you to come. I would not have missed it for the world, especially knowing you would be here." Edmund's eyes flicked briefly, dismissively, toward Julian, clearly failing to register the significance of who he was addressing so casually. "Might I claim the next dance, Miss Ashworth?" Eleanor hesitated, painfully aware of both her mother's watchful eyes from across the room and Julian's silent, considering presence beside her. "I believe," Julian said smoothly, before Eleanor could answer, "that the next dance has already been promised." Edmund's expression shifted, a flicker of irritation crossing his face as he finally seemed to register the quality of the stranger's clothing, the easy authority in his voice. "I beg your pardon, sir. I do not believe we have been introduced." "Julian Harrogate," Julian said simply, offering a small, unhurried bow. The name landed visibly. Edmund's face went through a rapid series of expressions, surprise giving way to poorly concealed alarm, and then to a stiff, overcorrected attempt at deference. "Your Grace. Forgive me, I had no idea. I did not mean any disrespect." "None taken," Julian replied pleasantly, though there was a faint edge beneath the politeness that Eleanor was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. "I simply thought I should clarify the matter of the dance before any confusion arose." Edmund glanced uncertainly between Julian and Eleanor, clearly recalculating something in his mind, some private assessment of the situation's implications. "Of course, Your Grace. Miss Ashworth, perhaps another dance, later in the evening?" Perhaps, Eleanor said, offering nothing further, and Edmund retreated with as much dignity as he could manage, though his ears had turned a visible shade of red. Once he was safely out of earshot, Eleanor turned to Julian with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. "That was not entirely honest of you, Your Grace. We had not in fact promised each other a dance." "We have now," Julian said, extending his hand toward her with an easy confidence that left little room for refusal. "Unless you would truly prefer to spend the evening discussing shipping tariffs with Mr. Blackwood instead." Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, aware of the dozens of eyes now openly watching them, aware of her mother's rigid posture and calculating expression, aware of the whispers already beginning to travel through the crowded room. Whatever came of this evening, she understood with sudden clarity that her carefully guarded, quiet life was about to become considerably more complicated. She placed her hand in his. The music began, and Julian led her onto the floor with the same unhurried confidence he brought to everything, his hand warm and steady at her waist as they moved through the opening steps. For a few precious minutes, surrounded by candlelight and music and the low murmur of an entire ballroom's worth of gossip, Eleanor allowed herself to simply enjoy the dance, to forget her mother's expectations and Edmund Blackwood's smugness and the mounting debts waiting for her back at home. "You dance as though you would rather be anywhere else," Julian observed quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "I dance as though I am aware that half this room is watching us, and drawing conclusions that will reach my mother's ears before this song has even ended." "Does that trouble you?" "It troubles me, because my mother's conclusions rarely align with reality, and because reality, in this particular case, seems rather unlikely to align with her hopes." Julian's expression grew thoughtful, and for a moment, the easy humor faded into something more serious. "What hopes might those be?" Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal, painfully aware of how foolish it would sound to say aloud, in the middle of a crowded ballroom, that her mother believed her too plain and too sharp-tongued to ever attract a man of consequence, let alone a duke. "My mother hopes for a great many things, Your Grace, most of which have very little to do with what I might hope for myself." "That is a diplomatic answer that tells me almost nothing." "It is the only answer I am prepared to give at present." He studied her for a long moment as the music continued around them, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "Very well, Eleanor. I will not press you further tonight, but I confess, I find myself increasingly curious about the woman I met on that dark road, the one who argued with me about the safest route to Marchford and refused to accept a compliment gracefully. I find I would like to know her better, whatever her mother's hopes may or may not be." The dance ended before Eleanor could formulate a response, and Julian released her with a formal bow that did nothing to diminish the warmth in his eyes. Across the room, she caught sight of her mother, already moving toward her, with quick, purposeful steps, and beyond her, standing near the far wall, a woman Eleanor did not recognize, watching the two of them, with a sharp, assessing stare that felt far less friendly than mere curiosity. "Who was that?" Eleanor asked Julian quietly, nodding toward the stranger. Julian followed her gaze, and something like weariness crossed his features. "Lady Beatrice Fenwick's cousin, Miss Cordelia Vane. She has made her interest in my title rather plain over the past several months, an interest I have done nothing to encourage." Before Eleanor could ask anything further, her mother arrived at her side, breathless with barely contained excitement, her earlier cruelty entirely absent from her voice, as she addressed Julian with the kind of eager warmth she had never once shown her own daughter. "Your Grace, what an honor. I am Margaret Ashworth, Eleanor's mother. I do hope my daughter has not bored you with her opinions this evening. She can be somewhat outspoken, I'm afraid, though we are working diligently to correct it." Eleanor felt a hot flush of humiliation rise in her cheeks. Julian's expression, however, remained perfectly composed, though something cool entered his tone that had not been there a moment before. "On the contrary, Mrs. Ashworth, I found your daughter's opinions to be the most interesting conversation I have had at any gathering in this county. I would consider it a great loss if anyone attempted to correct them." Margaret's smile faltered slightly, clearly uncertain how to respond to praise so directly contradicting her own assessment of her daughter, but she recovered quickly, her instincts for social advancement overriding her confusion. "How very generous of you to say so, Your Grace. Eleanor has always had a keen mind, of course. I have simply worried that gentlemen might not always appreciate it. Then perhaps, Mrs. Ashworth, the gentlemen in question were simply not worth appreciating it. The words landed with quiet precision, and Eleanor watched her mother's face cycle rapidly through several emotions before settling, uneasily, on a strained smile. Across the ballroom, Eleanor noticed Miss Cordelia Vane still watching them, her expression sharpening into something that looked distinctly like resentment, and she felt a small, uneasy shiver pass through her. A sense that whatever had begun that night on the dark road, it was already becoming far more complicated, and far more visible, than she had ever intended it to be. Julian excused himself shortly after, called away by an older gentleman, eager to discuss some matter of local politics, but not before catching Eleanor's eye one final time and offering a small, private smile that seemed to carry a promise of some kind, though she could not have said exactly what it promised. As the evening wore on, Eleanor found herself unable to fully enjoy the remainder of the assembly, painfully aware of the whispers now following her through every room, the sideways glances from other young women who had spent years overlooking her entirely, the calculating light that had returned, brighter than ever, to her mother's eyes. She danced twice more with Edmund Blackwood, enduring his tedious commentary on shipping routes with a patience she did not truly feel, all the while aware of Julian's presence somewhere across the room, a steady point of warmth in an otherwise exhausting evening. It was not until she was climbing into the carriage to return home, well past midnight, that her mother finally spoke, her voice trembling with an excitement that bordered on disbelief. "A duke, Eleanor, the Duke of Harrogate himself, speaking to you as though you were the only woman in that entire room." I could scarcely believe my own eyes. It was a single dance, Mother, nothing more. A single dance with the most eligible man in this county, after he publicly declared his interest in your conversation, before an entire ballroom of witnesses. Do you have any idea what that means for us, Eleanor? For this family? Eleanor stared out the carriage window into the darkness, watching the familiar hedgerows pass by, and felt a strange, hollow ache settle in her chest. A week ago, her mother had declared with absolute certainty that no gentleman would ever desire her. Now, having seen a duke show her the slightest flicker of interest, that same mother was already calculating exactly how much value her daughter's affection might be worth on the marriage market, as though nothing had changed except the size of the potential prize. "I understand precisely what it means, Mother," Eleanor said quietly, and turned her face back toward the window, watching the dark countryside slide past, wondering what Julian had truly meant by his final smile, and dreading, more than she cared to admit, whatever her mother might attempt next in pursuit of a duke's fortune. The letter was already open when Eleanor came downstairs, her mother's fingers gripping it so tightly that the paper had begun to crease. "What is this?" Margaret demanded, holding it up before Eleanor had even reached the bottom step. "A letter from the Duke of Harrogate, addressed to you directly, delivered by his own footman this morning. Would you care to explain why a man of his rank is writing to my unmarried daughter with such familiarity?" Eleanor's stomach dropped. "You opened my letter?" "Of course I opened it. I am your mother, and I have a right to know what is being said to you by a man of his standing." Margaret thrust the paper toward her. "He asks whether you would care to walk with him in the gardens at Lady Fenwick's country house this Thursday. He signs it simply Julian, as though the two of you were already on intimate terms." Eleanor took the letter with trembling hands, scanning the familiar, confident handwriting, feeling a small warmth rise in her chest despite her mother's violation of her privacy. "We spoke only twice, Mother. Once on the road, and once at the assembly. And in that time he has apparently decided he wishes to walk with you unchaperoned in a garden. Do you understand what this means, Eleanor? Do you understand what people will say if word of this reaches the wrong ears, before a proper understanding exists between you? There is no understanding between us, proper or otherwise. He has simply asked me to walk with him. A duke does not simply ask an unmarried woman with no fortune to walk with him, unless he intends something by it," Margaret said, her voice sharpening with an urgency Eleanor found unsettling. "And you will accept his invitation, and you will conduct yourself with the utmost care, because I promise you, Eleanor, if this opportunity slips through your fingers, due to some foolish display of independence, I will never forgive you." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her sleeve, unwilling to let her mother see how much the words on the page had already affected her. "I will consider it." "You will accept it," Margaret corrected. And you will wear the blue muslin, the one that brings out your eyes. And you will practice smiling in the mirror until it looks less like you are enduring a headache. By the following afternoon, however, word of the letter had somehow already spread through the county, carried by servants' gossip and the eager tongues of guests who had witnessed the dance at Lady Fenwick's assembly. Eleanor first realized the extent of it when she visited the village shop and found the shopkeeper's wife regarding her with a new, curious interest, asking pointed questions about the Duke of Harrowgate's intentions in a tone that suggested she already believed she knew the answer. By the time Eleanor returned home, her mother was in a state of barely controlled excitement, having received no fewer than 3 visits from neighboring families, eager to hear the details firsthand, each of them departing with expressions that mixed genuine curiosity with a thin veneer of politeness over what Eleanor suspected was considerable envy. "Everyone is speaking of it," Margaret said, practically glowing. Lady Whitmore herself asked whether the rumors of an engagement were true. "An engagement, Eleanor, after a single dance and 1 letter. Do you see now what is possible, if only you play your part correctly? There is no engagement, Mother. There is a walk in a garden, nothing more." But the gossip, once loosed, seemed to take on a life of its own, growing more elaborate with each retelling, and Eleanor found herself increasingly uneasy at the speed with which her private conversations were becoming public spectacle. Worse still, Edmund Blackwood, upon hearing the rumors, had apparently redoubled his own efforts, arriving unannounced at the Ashworth house, only 2 days later, with an urgency that made Eleanor's skin prickle with discomfort. "Miss Ashworth," Edmund said, standing rather too close in the small drawing room, while Margaret hovered nearby, clearly torn between 2 competing ambitions. "I have heard talk of the Duke's attentions toward you, and I confess, I find it necessary to speak plainly. My own intentions have been sincere since our first meeting, and I would ask that you consider my suit before allowing yourself to be swept up in the flattery of a title. Mr. Blackwood, I have made no promises to anyone." "Then perhaps it is time you did," Edmund pressed, his usual bland pleasantness replaced by something more insistent. "My father is prepared to offer a very generous settlement, one that would resolve your family's difficulties entirely, and swiftly. A duke's attention, however flattering, is uncertain. My offer is not." Margaret's expression, Eleanor noticed with a sinking feeling, had shifted subtly toward genuine consideration of this argument. The practical certainty of Edmund's wealth weighed against the glamorous but unproven possibility of a ducal match. "Mr. Blackwood raises a fair point, Eleanor. A bird in hand, as they say." "I am not a bird to be caught, Mother, by whichever hand offers the quickest grasp. You are a woman with very little time left to secure this family's future," Margaret snapped, her earlier warmth evaporating in an instant, "and I will not have you gambling everything on the passing fancy of a man who may lose interest the moment a more suitable match presents itself. Mr. Blackwood's offer is real. This other business with the Duke may be nothing more than idle amusement on his part, a diversion before he returns his attention to women of proper rank and fortune." The words stung more than Eleanor cared to admit, not because she believed Julian's interest was insincere, but because some small, wounded part of her, shaped by years of her mother's criticism, could not fully dismiss the possibility that her mother might, in this instance, be right. That evening, alone in her room, Eleanor read Julian's letter again by candlelight, tracing the confident lines of his handwriting, remembering the warmth in his eyes as he had danced with her, the genuine curiosity in his voice as he asked about her opinions. She wanted, desperately, to believe in the possibility he represented. But 3 months of mounting debt, her mother's escalating pressure, and Edmund Blackwood's persistent, practical offer, all pressed against that hope like a slowly closing vice. It was 2 days later, at a small garden party hosted by one of the neighboring families, that matters came to an unexpected head. Eleanor had not been told that Julian was expected, and her mother, seizing what she saw as the perfect opportunity, had all but pushed Eleanor into a private conversation with Edmund Blackwood, beneath the shade of an old oak tree, positioning herself just close enough to oversee the proceedings, without technically appearing to eavesdrop. "Miss Ashworth," Edmund was saying, his voice low and urgent, "I must ask you directly. Will you accept my proposal? My father is prepared to finalize the settlement within the week, if you agree. And I believe such certainty would ease your family's burdens considerably faster than continuing to wait on the uncertain interest of a man who has offered you nothing beyond a single letter." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, uncertain even herself what words might emerge, when a familiar voice cut cleanly through the tension of the moment. "Forgive the interruption." Every head within earshot turned. Julian stood at the edge of the garden path, dressed for riding rather than for a social gathering, his expression carrying none of its usual easy humor. He had clearly not been invited, and his sudden, uninvited appearance sent a visible ripple of shock through the assembled guests, most of whom had certainly heard the rumors circulating about him and Eleanor, but had not expected to witness their collision firsthand. "Your Grace," Margaret gasped, hurrying forward with a mixture of alarm and barely concealed delight. "We had no notice of your arrival. Had we known, we would have—" "I apologize for the intrusion, Mrs. Ashworth," Julian said, though his eyes remained fixed on Eleanor, who stood frozen beneath the oak tree, caught between the two men. "I had hoped to speak with your daughter regarding a letter I sent several days ago, one that appears to have gone unanswered." "I have been considering my response, Your Grace," Eleanor said carefully, acutely aware of the dozens of curious eyes now watching every word. "I see," Julian said, glancing briefly, pointedly, at Edmund, who stood rigid with poorly concealed irritation at the interruption. "And has your consideration reached any conclusion?" Edmund stepped forward before Eleanor could answer, his voice carrying an edge of challenge she had not heard from him before. "Your Grace, forgive my bluntness, but Miss Ashworth and I were in the midst of a private conversation regarding a matter of considerable importance to both our families." "Were you?" Julian said, his tone perfectly polite, perfectly cold. "And what matter might that be, if I may ask, given that the lady in question appears to have gone quite pale during your conversation, which strikes me as an unusual response to good news?" The garden fell silent. Eleanor felt every pair of eyes shift toward her, waiting, and she understood with sudden clarity that whatever she said next, in front of this entire gathering of neighbors and gossips, would determine the course of the following weeks, perhaps the rest of her life. "Mr. Blackwood asked for my hand," Eleanor said finally, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart. I had not yet given him an answer. Julian's expression did not change dramatically, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle tension entering his shoulders that suggested the news had struck him harder than his composed features let on. "I see. Then I have interrupted a moment that was not mine to interrupt, and I apologize for my poor timing." He turned toward Margaret with a small, formal bow. "Mrs. Ashworth, please forgive the intrusion. I will not trouble your family further today." "Your Grace, please, there is no need to leave so hastily," Margaret said quickly, clearly torn between two prizes she had never expected to be competing for so publicly. "Perhaps we might discuss another time, perhaps." Julian's gaze returned briefly, one final time, to Eleanor, and in that brief look she saw something that was not quite anger and not quite hurt, but some complicated mixture of both, quickly masked behind the practiced composure of a man accustomed to concealing his true feelings from a watching world. "I wish you every happiness, Miss Ashworth, in whatever you decide." He turned and walked back down the garden path toward his waiting horse, without another word, and Eleanor stood beneath the old oak tree, watching him go, feeling as though something vital had just slipped through her fingers before she had ever properly held it. Around her, the garden erupted into a fresh storm of whispers, and Edmund Blackwood, apparently satisfied that his rival had been sufficiently discouraged, turned back to Eleanor with a smile that now felt entirely insufferable. "Well, Miss Ashworth," he said, "shall we return to our conversation?" Eleanor did not answer him immediately. She was still watching the empty garden path where Julian had disappeared, her heart aching with a confusion of regret and frustration, and something that felt uncomfortably close to grief, for a possibility she had not even allowed herself to fully imagine, and had now, through her own careful, self-protective silence, very possibly destroyed. She did not yet know that her hesitant, half-formed answer that afternoon would set into motion a chain of events that would, within a matter of days, force her mother's hand entirely, push Edmund Blackwood's family to demand an immediate and binding settlement, and leave Eleanor with only hours, rather than weeks, to decide what kind of future she was truly willing to accept. Nor did she know that Julian, riding away from that garden with a tightness in his chest he had not felt in years, had already resolved not to give up so easily, whatever composure he had shown in that painful, public moment beneath the oak tree. The solicitor's papers lay spread across the dining table like a trap already sprung, and Eleanor stared at them with a hollow feeling spreading through her chest. "Mr. Blackwood's father insists the settlement be signed by tomorrow evening," Margaret said, pacing the length of the room with quick, anxious steps. "He says the offer of the Duke's attention has made him wary of delay, and honestly, Eleanor, after that disaster in the garden, I can hardly blame him. You very nearly cost us everything with your hesitation." "I did not hesitate on purpose, Mother. I simply did not know how to answer a question I had not yet decided for myself." "You no longer have the luxury of deciding for yourself." Margaret snatched up one of the papers, thrusting it toward her daughter. "Read it. The settlement clears every debt your father left behind, secures Charlotte's future, and guarantees this house remains in our family. All you must do is sign your name beneath Edmund's tomorrow evening, at 7 o'clock, in front of both families and the solicitor." Eleanor took the paper with numb fingers, scanning the dense legal language without truly absorbing any of it. Outside, the wind had picked up considerably over the course of the afternoon, rattling the window panes and bending the tall grass in the fields beyond the garden wall. Dark clouds had been gathering on the horizon since midday, and the air carried the heavy, electric smell that always preceded a serious autumn storm. "And if I do not wish to sign it?" Eleanor asked quietly. Margaret's face hardened into an expression Eleanor had rarely seen, something beyond her usual sharp disapproval, something closer to genuine desperation. "Then we lose this house within the month, Eleanor, and Charlotte's prospects are ruined alongside your own, because no respectable family will consider a match with a girl whose sister publicly humiliated a wealthy suitor for the sake of a duke's idle flirtation that came to nothing. Do you understand what you would be sacrificing, not just for yourself, but for your sister, for all of us?" Eleanor looked past her mother, out the rain-streaked window, toward the dark fields where she had once sat alone on a stone wall, wondering what her future might hold. She thought of Julian's face in the garden, the careful composure that had not quite hidden his disappointment, and she felt a fresh wave of regret at how badly she had handled that moment, how her own fear of appearing foolish or presumptuous had cost her the chance to simply tell the truth. "I will consider it tonight, Mother," she said finally. "I will give you my answer in the morning." It was not the answer Margaret wanted, but something in Eleanor's tone, some new firmness that had not been there before, seemed to convince her mother that further argument that evening would accomplish nothing. Margaret retreated to her own room with a final, weary warning about the consequences of further delay, leaving Eleanor alone in the darkening dining room with the settlement papers still spread before her like an accusation. She sat there for a long while as the storm outside grew steadily worse, thunder rolling in the distance, rain beginning to lash against the windows in heavy, driving sheets. She thought of writing to Julian, of somehow explaining everything that had happened in that garden, the fear and confusion that had made her answer so carelessly. But what could she possibly say that would undo the damage, especially now, with only hours remaining before she was expected to sign her future away to a man she did not love? It was Charlotte who found her still sitting there near midnight, a single candle burning low beside the untouched papers. "You cannot marry him, Eleanor," Charlotte said quietly, closing the door behind her. "I have watched you these past weeks. I have never seen you speak of anyone the way you speak of the Duke, not even in the stories you used to read to me when we were younger. Whatever happened in that garden, it is not too late to fix it. It is nearly midnight, Charlotte, and I am meant to sign that contract by 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. There is no time left to fix anything. Then send him a message tonight. In this storm, Silas would never make it past the first bridge, and even if he did, what would I say? That I am sorry for my cowardice in the garden. And would he perhaps consider still caring for me, despite everything?" "Yes," Charlotte said simply. "Exactly that, the truth, Eleanor. You have spent your whole life being clever and careful and guarded, and look where it has brought you. Perhaps it is time to simply tell the truth and see what happens, rather than protecting yourself from disappointment by refusing to try at all." Eleanor stared at her younger sister for a long moment, struck by the simple wisdom of the words, spoken by a girl who had not yet learned to be as cautious and self-protective as their mother's constant criticism had taught Eleanor to be. "Even if I wrote to him tonight," Eleanor said slowly, "there is no guarantee the letter would reach him in time, or that he would still wish to hear from me after everything. Then write it anyway. At least you will know you tried, rather than always wondering." It was that thought, more than any hope of success, that finally moved Eleanor to action. She found a fresh sheet of paper, dipped her pen, and wrote quickly, before her own fear could talk her out of it again. A short letter explaining everything. Her fear in the garden, her genuine feelings, the contract awaiting her signature the following evening, and a final, honest admission that she did not wish to marry Edmund Blackwood, that some part of her had been hoping, foolishly perhaps, for a different future entirely. She sealed the letter and found Silas already awake in the stables, unable to sleep through the violence of the storm, and though he expressed serious doubts about the wisdom of riding out in such weather, something in Eleanor's desperate expression convinced him to attempt the journey regardless, taking the smaller, more sheltered back roads rather than risking the exposed main route. What Eleanor did not know, as she watched Silas disappear into the storm-lashed darkness, was that at Harrogate Hall, several miles distant, Julian was at that very moment standing at his own window, watching the same storm rage across his estate, unable to shake the image of Eleanor's pale, frightened face in the garden, the way she had looked at him as though asking for something she could not bring herself to say aloud. He had spent the days since the garden party in a state of restless frustration, half convinced he should simply accept her apparent choice and move forward with his life, and half unable to stop thinking of the sharp, honest woman he had met on the Marchford Road, the one who had argued with him about tax policy and refused every attempt at empty flattery. When his steward informed him, close to midnight, that a soaked and exhausted rider had arrived at the gate insisting on delivering a letter directly into the Duke's hands, Julian felt his heart lurch with a hope he had been trying, unsuccessfully, to suppress for days. He read Eleanor's letter twice by the light of a single candle, the words growing more urgent with each reading. A settlement to be signed by 7 o'clock the following evening. A confession of feelings she had been too afraid to voice in the garden. A quiet, desperate hope that it was not already too late. Julian did not hesitate. "Ready my horse," he told his startled steward, "the fastest one in the stable, and have a fresh mount waiting at the halfway inn, in case mine tires before I reach Ashworth Land. Your Grace, in this storm, the roads will be treacherous, and the river crossing near Marchford floods badly in weather like this. I am aware of the danger. Ready the horse." Within 20 minutes, Julian was riding out into the heart of the storm, rain driving hard against his face, lightning splitting the sky in jagged white bursts that briefly illuminated the flooded fields on either side of the road. His horse, a powerful animal, accustomed to difficult terrain, fought gamely against the wind and the treacherous, mud-slicked ground. But even so, their progress was agonizingly slow, compared to the urgency burning in Julian's chest. The first serious obstacle came at the old stone bridge near Marchford, the very bridge Eleanor had warned him against on the night of their first meeting. Julian reined in hard, staring at the swollen river rushing beneath it, the water level dangerously close to the bridge's ancient, weathered stones. He could see, even in the darkness, that sections of the old structure had already begun to crumble under the pressure of the flood. He thought of turning back toward the longer river road, the safer route Eleanor herself had recommended weeks earlier, but a glance at the position of the moon behind the storm clouds told him he had already lost precious time, and the longer route would cost him at least another hour, an hour he was not certain he could afford if he hoped to reach Ashworth Manor before the settlement was signed. Julian dismounted and led his horse carefully onto the bridge, testing each section with cautious steps, feeling the ancient stones shift and groan beneath the pressure of the rushing water below. Halfway across, a particularly violent gust of wind sent his horse skittering sideways, and for one heart-stopping moment, Julian feared they would both be swept off the crumbling structure into the flooded river beneath. He held firm to the reins, speaking low, steady words to calm the frightened animal, and together, they inched their way across the remaining length of the bridge, finally reaching solid ground on the far side, just as a large section of the old stone parapet gave way behind them, crashing into the churning water, with a sound like a cannon blast. Shaken but unharmed, Julian remounted and pushed onward, the storm showing no signs of relenting. He reached the halfway inn nearly an hour later than planned, his first horse exhausted and trembling, and switched quickly to the fresh mount his steward had arranged, barely pausing long enough to catch his own breath before continuing on into the darkness. The final miles proved the most difficult of all. The road to Ashworth Manor, never particularly well maintained, had become a treacherous stretch of mud and standing water, and more than once, Julian's horse stumbled badly enough that he feared they might both go down entirely. His hands had gone numb from the cold and the relentless rain, his clothes soaked completely through, but he did not slow his pace, driven forward by the memory of Eleanor's letter, the raw honesty of her words, the fear that he might arrive too late to matter. As dawn began to break, gray and reluctant behind the retreating storm clouds, Julian finally crested the last hill overlooking Ashworth Manor, the familiar shape of the house emerging slowly from the mist below. He had ridden through an entire night of storm and flood and treacherous roads, and as he urged his exhausted horse down the final slope toward the house, he felt a fierce, unshakable certainty settle over him, a resolve that whatever obstacles Eleanor's family or her own fears had placed between them, he did not intend to let them stand any longer. Inside the house, Eleanor had not slept at all, sitting awake by her window through the entire night, watching the storm rage and finally begin to fade, wondering with increasing despair whether Silas had reached Harrogate Hall safely, whether Julian had even received her letter, and whether, even if he had, anything could truly be done before the fateful hour of 7 o'clock that evening. As the first gray light of dawn crept across the sky, she heard, faint but unmistakable in the sudden quiet after the storm, the distant sound of a single horse approaching the house at a hard, desperate gallop. Eleanor was at the front door before she had even fully registered moving, her bare feet cold against the stone floor, her hair still loose from a sleepless night, and she threw it open, just as Julian was pulling his exhausted, mud-splattered horse to a stop in the drive. "Julian," she breathed, hardly able to believe what she was seeing. He swung down from the saddle with obvious effort, his movements stiff with cold and exhaustion, his fine clothes soaked through and streaked with mud, his dark hair plastered flat against his forehead. He looked nothing like the composed, effortlessly confident Duke she had danced with at the assembly, and everything like a man who had spent an entire night fighting against a storm to reach her, which, she realized with a rush of overwhelming emotion, was exactly what he had done. "I received your letter," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold and the long hours of riding. "I came as quickly as I could." "You rode through that storm? All night?" "There was a bridge that very nearly did not survive the crossing, and a river road I chose not to take, because it would have cost me an hour I did not believe I could spare. I have never been more frightened in my life, and I have never been more certain of anything than I was of the need to reach you before that contract could be signed." Eleanor felt tears rising, unbidden, at the raw honesty in his voice, at the evidence, standing exhausted and soaked before her, of exactly how much her letter had meant to him. "I am so sorry, Julian, for the garden, for my silence, when you asked me directly. I was afraid, and I let that fear speak for me instead of the truth." "I understand fear," Julian said quietly, stepping closer despite his exhaustion. "But I would ask that you never let it speak for you again, not where I am concerned. I would rather hear a difficult truth from you than a careful, protective silence." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of the front door opening wider revealed Margaret, still in her nightclothes, her expression shifting rapidly from confusion to shock as she took in the scene before her, a Duke standing soaked and exhausted in her driveway at dawn, clearly having ridden through the night to reach her daughter. "Your Grace," Margaret said, her voice unsteady, "what on earth has happened? Why are you here, in this state, at this hour?" "Mrs. Ashworth," Julian said, straightening despite his obvious exhaustion, his voice gaining a formal edge that Eleanor had not heard from him before. "I received a letter from your daughter last night, informing me of a settlement she is meant to sign this evening. A settlement to Mr. Blackwood, that I understand she does not wish to enter into. I have come to speak with her directly, and with you, before that contract can be finalized." Margaret's expression cycled rapidly through several emotions, settling finally on a kind of desperate, calculating anxiety. "Your Grace, I do not know what my daughter has written to you, but our family's circumstances require a swift and certain resolution. Mr. Blackwood's offer is generous and immediate. I cannot simply set it aside on the strength of a letter and a single dance." "Then perhaps you should set it aside on the strength of your daughter's own wishes, rather than the strength of my letter or hers." Julian's voice remained controlled, but there was a hardness beneath it now, a steel that Eleanor had glimpsed only briefly before, during their first meeting on the dark road. "I have heard, Mrs. Ashworth, secondhand and through the general gossip of this county, some of the things you have said to your daughter regarding her prospects, that no gentleman would ever desire her, that she should be grateful for whatever offer came her way, regardless of her own feelings on the matter. Margaret's face went pale. "I do not know what you have heard, Your Grace, but a mother's words in a private moment of frustration are hardly. I heard them from Eleanor herself, spoken with a quiet acceptance that broke something in me to witness," Julian continued, his voice growing firmer with each word. "I have ridden through a storm that very nearly cost me my life, across a bridge that collapsed only moments after I crossed it, because I could not bear the thought of your daughter believing, even for one more day, that she was somehow unworthy of being chosen, truly and wholly, by someone who sees her exactly as she is." The words hung in the cold morning air, and Eleanor felt something break open inside her chest. Some long-held wound finally beginning, however painfully, to heal. "You do not understand our situation," Margaret said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier certainty. "This family faces ruin, Your Grace. Every practical consideration points toward Mr. Blackwood's offer. Then let me offer a practical consideration of my own." Julian reached into his soaked coat and withdrew a folded paper, considerably worse for wear after its journey through the storm, but still legible. "I had this drawn up before I left Harrogate Hall last night, in the event that words alone might not be sufficient to convince you. It outlines my intention to court your daughter properly, with full transparency of purpose, and to settle her family's outstanding debts myself, immediately, regardless of whatever answer she ultimately gives me, because I do not believe love should ever be purchased through desperation, nor withheld through fear of poverty." Margaret stared at the paper, as though it might disappear if she looked away, her mouth opening and closing several times without producing any sound. At that moment, the sound of an approaching carriage drew everyone's attention, and Edmund Blackwood himself climbed down, apparently having arrived early to discuss the final arrangements for the evening's signing, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to outrage as he took in the scene before him. "What is the meaning of this?" Edmund demanded, striding forward. "Your Grace, I was under the impression that Miss Ashworth had already made her decision regarding my proposal." "Miss Ashworth's decision," Julian said, turning to face him directly, "was made under considerable pressure, fear, and misinformation, none of which reflect her true wishes. I would ask that you release her from any obligation she may feel toward your family's offer, given that it was never truly her choice to accept it in the first place." "This is outrageous," Edmund sputtered. "We have a contract prepared, witnesses arranged, my father's solicitor already on his way." "Then your father's solicitor has made an unnecessary journey," Julian said calmly, "because I do not believe Miss Ashworth intends to sign anything this evening that was not written from a place of genuine choice." All eyes turned to Eleanor, who stood in the doorway still in her nightclothes, her hair loose and windblown, feeling more exposed and more certain of herself in that moment than she had felt in her entire life. She looked first at her mother, whose expression had shifted from desperate calculation to something almost pleading, and then at Edmund, whose face had reddened with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, and finally at Julian, standing exhausted and mud-splattered before her, having risked his own safety through an entire night of storm, simply to give her the chance to choose freely, rather than out of fear or desperation. "Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "I am sorry for the confusion my silence in the garden caused you, and I am grateful, genuinely, for your family's willingness to help ease our circumstances. But I cannot marry you, not out of fear or gratitude alone, and it would be a disservice to us both to pretend otherwise any longer." Edmund's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Eleanor feared some ugly response, but instead, he simply exhaled sharply, some of the anger draining from his expression, replaced by a weary, almost relieved resignation. "I suspected as much in truth, though I did not wish to admit it to myself. I will inform my father that the arrangement is withdrawn." He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at Eleanor, with something almost like respect. "For what it is worth, Miss Ashworth, I hope you find the happiness you are clearly seeking elsewhere." He climbed back into his carriage without another word, and it rolled away down the drive, leaving Eleanor, Julian, and Margaret standing in the pale morning light. Margaret turned to her daughter, her expression a complicated mixture of shock, uncertainty, and something Eleanor had rarely seen from her, a flicker of genuine remorse. "Eleanor, I only ever wanted what was best for this family. For you." "I know, Mother," Eleanor said quietly, "but what was best for the family was not always what was best for me." and I do not believe you ever fully understood the difference, or cared to." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, toward the house, toward the settlement papers still waiting on the dining table inside, evidence of an entire future that had, in the space of a single storm-battered morning, been swept away entirely. "I do not know what to say to that." "You need not say anything yet," Eleanor said, some of the old hardness in her heart softening slightly at her mother's visible distress. "We have time to talk, properly, later. For now, I think His Grace requires dry clothes and rest, having ridden all night through a storm that nearly cost him his life." Julian, despite his exhaustion, managed a small, warm smile at that, the first genuine smile Eleanor had seen from him since his arrival. "I would not say no to dry clothes, though I confess the ride was worth every difficult mile, given the outcome." Margaret, still visibly shaken but apparently recognizing the shifting reality of the situation, managed a stiff nod and retreated inside to arrange for the necessary hospitality, leaving Eleanor and Julian alone in the quiet, rain-washed morning. "You did not have to risk your life crossing that bridge," Eleanor said softly, reaching out to touch the sleeve of his ruined coat, still damp and cold beneath her fingers. "You could have taken the longer road." "I considered it," Julian admitted, "but I found I could not bear the thought of arriving even an hour later than necessary, not when every hour brought you closer to a future you did not truly want. I have spent 2 years since inheriting this title, surrounded by people who want something from me, my rank, my fortune, my influence. I had nearly forgotten what it felt like to want something for someone else entirely, without any thought of what it might cost me." "And what do you want, Julian, truly, now that the storm has passed and the danger is behind us?" He studied her for a long moment, his exhausted features softening into something quieter, more vulnerable than she had ever seen from him. "I want the chance to know you properly, Eleanor Ashworth, not as a duke courting a suitable match, but as the man who argued with you about the safest road to Marchford, and found himself, against all his own expectations, thoroughly captivated by your refusal to accept easy compliments or comfortable lies." Eleanor felt her heart swell with an emotion she had spent years convincing herself she would never be permitted to feel, not after so many years of her mother's insistence that she was unworthy of true, chosen love. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like that very much, Your Grace." "Julian," he corrected gently, "I believe, after last night, we are well past the point of formal titles between us." "Julian," Eleanor repeated, testing the name with a small, genuine smile of her own, the first true smile she had allowed herself in longer than she could remember. Behind them, the sun finally broke fully through the retreating storm clouds, casting warm morning light across the muddy drive, and the exhausted horse still standing patiently nearby. And Eleanor felt, for the first time in her entire life, that the future stretching ahead of her might hold something other than the narrow, joyless path her mother had always insisted was the only one available to her. 3 weeks after the storm, Eleanor found herself standing at the same garden window where Julian had once interrupted her conversation with Edmund Blackwood, and the memory of that painful afternoon rose up so suddenly and sharply that her hands trembled against the windowsill. "You have grown quiet again," Julian said, entering the small sitting room where she had retreated during a pause in the afternoon's visit. "You did that often before the storm, whenever something troubled you that you did not wish to voice aloud. I had hoped we were past that." Eleanor turned to face him, surprised, as always, by how easily he read her, by how little effort he seemed to require to see straight through the careful composure she had spent years perfecting. "I am simply thinking, Julian, nothing more." "About what?" She hesitated, aware that honesty had already served her well once before, when it had felt safest to hide behind careful silence. "About whether this is real, truly. Whether you have chosen me because you know me, or because I represent some interesting rebellion against the expectations placed upon you, a duke who defies convention by courting a woman with no fortune and a sharp tongue. I worry, sometimes, that once the novelty fades, you will see me the way my mother has always insisted the world would see me." Julian was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor braced herself for reassurance, for easy comfort that would not truly address the fear sitting heavy in her chest. Instead, he crossed the room and sat down beside her, his expression serious and thoughtful rather than dismissive. "That is a fair question," and I will not insult you with an easy answer, he said. I cannot promise you that novelty plays no part in what first drew me to you, Eleanor. You were unlike anyone I had met in years, and there is undoubtedly something appealing in that difference, at first. But novelty fades quickly, within weeks, and what has remained since then has nothing to do with rebellion or difference for its own sake. Then what has remained? The way you argue a point until you have fully convinced yourself of its truth, rather than simply repeating whatever opinion is expected of you. The way you softened, just slightly, when your sister needed comfort during our visit last week, though you tried very hard not to let anyone see it. The steadiness in you, beneath all the sharpness, the way you have carried your family's burdens for years, without ever once asking anyone to carry them for you. These are not qualities that fade with familiarity, Eleanor. If anything, I find myself admiring them more deeply with each week that passes, not less. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome, though she did not try as hard to hide them as she once might have. My mother spent so many years telling me these very qualities were the reason no one would ever want me. It is difficult, even now, to fully believe that the opposite might be true. Your mother was wrong, Julian said simply, without hesitation. Not simply wrong about me, but wrong in general, about what makes a woman worth choosing. I do not say that to dismiss the pain her words caused you, because I understand that years of hearing something repeated, even something entirely false, leaves marks that do not disappear overnight simply because one person disagrees. But I will keep disagreeing, Eleanor, as often and as loudly as necessary, until you no longer need to hear it from me, because you have finally come to believe it yourself. They sat together in silence for a while after that, Eleanor absorbing his words slowly, feeling something in her chest that had been clenched tight for years, beginning, cautiously, to loosen. There is something else, she said finally. Something I have not yet told you, and I think perhaps I should, before we go any further. Tell me. When I was younger, before my father died, I dreamed of studying properly, of perhaps even attending lectures in the city, the way some of the more progressive families were beginning to allow their daughters to do. My father encouraged it, quietly, though my mother thought the idea entirely improper. After he died, that dream simply became impossible, buried beneath debts and expectations, and the constant pressure to secure a suitable marriage instead. I do not know if I still want that life, exactly, not after everything that has happened since. But I do not wish to become a duchess who exists only to host dinners and manage a household, forgetting entirely the woman who once wanted more than that for herself. Julian listened to this with careful attention, none of the polite dismissiveness she had half expected. Even now, some deeply ingrained part of her still bracing for disappointment. Then we shall find a way for you to have both, he said. I will not pretend a duchess's responsibilities are light ones, Eleanor, because they are not, and I would not deceive you into believing otherwise. But I see no reason those responsibilities must consume every part of who you are, or every ambition you once held for yourself. My own mother, before she passed, maintained a rather serious study of botany throughout her marriage to my father, corresponding with several notable scholars and even publishing, under a modest pseudonym, a handful of respected papers on the subject. If she found room for her own passions within the demands of the title, I do not see why you should not find room for yours as well. Eleanor stared at him, genuinely startled by the revelation, and by the easy, unthreatened way he offered it, as though a woman's intellectual ambitions were not a flaw to be managed, but simply another facet of her character to be supported. You truly mean that? I would not say it otherwise. I have little patience for pretty words that promise more than they intend to deliver. That much, at least, I already knew about you, Eleanor said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her earlier seriousness. You made that clear enough on the Marchford Road, arguing about horses and river crossings with a woman you had only just met. I stand by every word of that argument, incidentally. The river road remains the safer route, storm or no storm, though I will admit, the bridge nearly cost me dearly for choosing otherwise. Their conversation drifted into lighter territory after that, the earlier tension easing into something warmer and more comfortable, but Eleanor found herself returning to his earlier words often over the following days, turning them over in her mind like small, precious stones. The steadiness in you, beneath all the sharpness. Qualities that do not fade with familiarity. It was a strange thing, after so many years of hearing herself described only in terms of her flaws, to begin hearing herself described instead in terms of her strengths, and stranger still to feel, slowly and cautiously, that perhaps this new description was closer to the truth than the old one had ever been. Her relationship with her mother, in the weeks following the storm, remained complicated, marked by careful, halting conversations that neither of them fully knew how to navigate after years of a very different kind of dynamic between them. Margaret had not transformed overnight into a warm, supportive mother, and Eleanor did not expect her to, but there were small, genuine moments of change that Eleanor noticed and quietly treasured. An unprompted compliment on her handling of a difficult conversation with a neighbor. A rare admission, offered stiffly but sincerely, that perhaps she had been too harsh in some of her past judgments. "I do not know how to be different than I have been," Margaret admitted to her one evening, several weeks after Julian's dramatic arrival, the two of them sitting together in the drawing room in a rare moment of quiet honesty. "I have spent so many years afraid of what would become of this family, of you and your sister, that I forgot, somewhere along the way, that fear does not excuse cruelty, even when it feels, at the time, like practical wisdom. I do not need you to be entirely different, Mother," Eleanor said carefully. "I simply need you to try, sometimes, to see me as I actually am, rather than only as a problem to be solved." Margaret nodded slowly, tears gathering in her eyes that she did not bother to hide, a rare vulnerability that Eleanor had almost never witnessed in her mother before. "I will try, Eleanor. I cannot promise I will always succeed, but I will try." It was not a complete resolution, not the kind of clean, tidy ending Eleanor might once have hoped for, but it was honest, and it was a beginning, and Eleanor found that she could accept an honest beginning far more easily than she could have accepted a false, easy peace. As the weeks passed, and her courtship with Julian deepened into something steadier and more certain, Eleanor found herself changing in small, gradual ways, standing a little straighter in rooms full of strangers, speaking her opinions a little more freely, without the immediate flash of anxious anticipation that had once accompanied every honest word she spoke. She began corresponding, tentatively at first, with a scholar in the city whose work on natural philosophy she had long admired, encouraged by Julian's genuine interest and by his quiet, steady reminder that her curiosity was a gift rather than a burden to be hidden. By the time autumn gave way fully to winter, Eleanor understood, with a clarity that felt hard-won and entirely her own, that whatever future awaited her with Julian, she was no longer entering it as a desperate woman grateful for whatever attention came her way, but as someone who had finally learned, through storm and heartbreak and slow, careful honesty, to believe in her own worth, independent of anyone else's judgment, even the judgment of the man who loved her. The morning of the wedding, a messenger arrived at Ashworth Manor, with news that sent the entire household into a fresh panic before the sun had even fully risen. "Miss Cordelia Vane has been spreading a story through the county," Charlotte reported breathlessly, having heard it first from one of the kitchen maids, whose sister worked in the Vane household. "She claims the Duke only proposed to secure a wager with Lord Percival Grant, that the entire courtship was arranged as a kind of joke among gentlemen, and that he intends to quietly set Eleanor aside within a year of the marriage." Eleanor, standing in the middle of her room in her half-finished wedding dress, felt the old, familiar cold spread through her chest, the instinctive fear that some cruel trick was about to be revealed at the very last moment, exposing her hopes as foolish after all. "Do you believe it?" "Of course I do not believe it," Charlotte said firmly. "But it has spread quickly, and several guests have already sent notes questioning whether the ceremony will proceed as planned. Mother is nearly beside herself downstairs." Eleanor closed her eyes for a long moment, forcing herself to breathe slowly, to resist the pull of old fears that told her, insistently, that surely this was the moment when everything good in her life would be revealed as illusion, that surely she had been foolish to believe, even for a season, that she was truly wanted, rather than merely being used for someone else's amusement. But then she thought of Julian standing soaked and exhausted in the driveway after his night ride through the storm, of the steady, unwavering conviction in his voice when he had spoken to her mother and to Edmund Blackwood, of the countless small moments since then when he had proven, again and again, that his affection for her was neither novelty nor cruelty, but something patient and genuine. She opened her eyes, and the fear, though not entirely gone, had lost much of its grip. "Send word to the hall," she said calmly. I wish to speak with Julian before the ceremony, regardless of whether it is considered proper to do so on the wedding day itself. Margaret, when informed of this plan, initially protested on the grounds of tradition and propriety, but something in her daughter's calm, unwavering expression convinced her, finally, not to argue the point further. Within the hour, Julian arrived at Ashworth Manor, dressed in his wedding finery but with an expression of controlled fury that Eleanor had not seen from him before. "I have already heard the story," he said, before Eleanor could even explain the situation fully. "Lord Percival Grant sent word to me himself, the moment he heard it circulating, horrified that his name had been attached to such an ugly fabrication. There was no wager, Eleanor. There has never been any wager. Cordelia Vane invented the entire story out of spite, because I made it clear, several months ago, that I had no interest in her attentions, and she has apparently decided that destroying my happiness elsewhere is an acceptable substitute." "I did not truly believe the story," Eleanor said carefully, "but I confess it frightened me regardless, hearing it on this particular morning." "I understand why it would," Julian said, his expression softening as he took her hands in his. "You have spent your whole life being told your worth was uncertain, conditional, easily revoked. A story like this, however false, speaks directly to that old fear. I cannot undo years of your mother's words with a single morning's reassurance, Eleanor, but I can tell you again, as many times as necessary, for as many years as we have together, that nothing about my feelings for you has ever been a joke, a wager, or a passing amusement." "Then let us address it properly," Eleanor said, some of her old, sharp resolve returning to steady her. "Before the ceremony, before the entire assembled county, rather than allowing this ugly rumor to hang over what should be a joyful day." Julian looked at her with something like admiration mixed with surprise. "You wish to confront it publicly, on your own wedding day? I have spent enough of my life allowing other people's lies and cruelties to shape how I understood myself and my own worth. I do not intend to let one more falsehood stand unchallenged, not on this day, and not on any day that follows it." And so, before the ceremony began, standing at the front of the small chapel filled with guests who had gathered amid considerable uncertainty regarding whether the wedding would even proceed, Julian addressed the assembled crowd directly, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "Before we begin," he said, "I understand that certain false rumors have reached many of you this morning. Rumors suggesting that my courtship of Miss Ashworth was conducted as some manner of jest or wager among gentlemen. I wish to state, clearly and for the record, that this story is entirely without foundation, invented by someone whose own disappointed hopes led her to attempt to poison what has been, without question, the most genuine and important relationship of my life." A murmur ran through the assembled guests, and Eleanor, standing beside him in her wedding dress, felt the last remnants of her earlier fear finally dissolve entirely, replaced by a fierce, grateful pride in the man standing beside her. "I met Eleanor Ashworth on a dark road, during a storm, when her carriage had broken down, and she had every reason to distrust a stranger offering assistance," Julian continued. "In the weeks since, I have found in her a sharpness of mind, a steadiness of character, and an honesty of spirit that I have encountered in no one else, of any rank or fortune, in my entire life. I do not marry her today out of obligation, or amusement, or any consideration beyond the simple, powerful truth that I love her, entirely and without reservation, and I consider myself fortunate beyond measure that she has chosen, despite every reason the world gave her to doubt herself, to love me in return." The chapel fell silent for a moment, and then, somewhere near the back, someone began to applaud, quickly followed by others, until the small stone chapel filled with warm, genuine approval that seemed to wash away, entirely, whatever lingering doubt Cordelia Vane's cruel invention had managed to plant. Margaret, seated in the front row, wept openly, though whether from relief, pride, or some complicated mixture of both, Eleanor could not entirely say, and did not think it mattered particularly which. When Eleanor caught her mother's eye across the chapel, Margaret offered a small, unsteady nod, an acknowledgement that seemed to carry within it years of complicated history, finally settling into something gentler than either of them had expected to reach. The ceremony proceeded without further disruption, and as Eleanor stood before the assembled guests, speaking her vows to a man who had ridden through a violent storm and defended her honor before an entire chapel of witnesses, she felt, for the first time in her life, entirely and unshakably certain of her own worth. independent of any title, any fortune, any judgment her mother or society had ever placed upon her. After the ceremony, during the celebration that followed at Harrogate Hall, Margaret found a quiet moment to approach her daughter, her expression carrying none of its old sharpness, only a kind of humbled sincerity that Eleanor had waited years to see. "I was wrong, Eleanor," Margaret said simply. "About so many things. I told you once that no gentleman would ever desire you, and I have thought of that cruel evening often in the months since, ashamed of how badly I misjudged both you and the world's capacity to recognize your worth. I am sorry, truly, for every time my fear made me cruel instead of kind." "Thank you, Mother," Eleanor said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant the forgiveness in those words entirely. "I think we have both learned a great deal this year, about fear, and about what truly matters when it comes to choosing a life worth living." Margaret nodded, wiping at her eyes, and for a moment mother and daughter simply stood together in comfortable silence, watching the celebration unfold around them, the warm candlelight and music and laughter filling Harrogate Hall with a joy that Eleanor had once believed entirely beyond her reach. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the guests began to depart, Julian found Eleanor standing alone on the terrace, looking out over the moonlit grounds of her new home, and came to stand quietly beside her. "Any regrets, Duchess?" he asked, testing her new title with obvious pleasure. "None," Eleanor said, leaning into him as his arms settled around her shoulders. "Though I confess I never imagined, on that cold evening, when my mother declared no gentleman would ever desire me, that I would end this year not only desired, but genuinely, thoroughly loved, by a man willing to ride through a storm and challenge an entire chapel of gossips on my behalf." "Your mother was remarkably, spectacularly wrong," Julian said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though I confess, I am grateful for her cruelty. In a strange way, because it shaped you into the woman who argued with me so fiercely on that dark road. The woman I could not stop thinking about from the very first moment we met." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound carrying out into the quiet night air, and turned to face the man who had ridden through storm and scandal alike to claim a future with her, feeling, at long last, entirely and completely at peace with exactly who she was. 3 years into her marriage, Eleanor was standing in the library at Harrogate Hall, 7 months pregnant with her second child, when a solicitor's letter arrived that made her blood run cold. "They cannot be serious," she said, reading the document a second time, then a third, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming. "A cousin of Julian's late brother, contesting the succession itself, on the grounds of some obscure clause in your grandfather's original title papers?" Julian, entering the library at the sound of alarm in her voice, took the letter from her hands and read it quickly, his expression darkening with each line. "Cousin Reginald, I should have known he would attempt something like this eventually. He has always resented that the title passed to my brother, and then to me, rather than to his own branch of the family. Can he truly succeed with such a claim? I do not know," Julian admitted, which frightened Eleanor more than any confident denial might have. "The clause he cites is genuinely obscure, buried in papers nearly 80 years old. If a court interprets it in his favor, it could theoretically call the entire line of succession into question, including our own children's claim to the title." Eleanor sat down heavily in the nearest chair, one hand resting protectively over the curve of her stomach, feeling the familiar cold press of fear that she had once believed she left behind entirely on her wedding day. But this fear felt different from the old ones, less about her own worth, and more about the family she had built, the life she had fought so hard to claim for herself, and now desperately wished to protect. "Then we must find a way to prove the claim has no merit," she said, straightening her shoulders, with the same firm resolve that had once led her to argue tax policy at her mother's dinner table. "Send for the original papers, Julian. Every document related to the title, going back as far as we can find them. If Reginald intends to fight this with obscure legal language, we shall meet him with equally thorough research." Over the following weeks, Eleanor threw herself into the challenge, with an intensity that surprised even Julian, spending long hours in the estate archives poring over documents, letters, and legal records that had not been examined in decades, determined to find the flaw in Reginald's claim before it could be presented in court. Her old correspondence with the scholar in the city, maintained faithfully over the years since her engagement, proved unexpectedly useful, as several of his colleagues specialized in precisely the kind of historical legal interpretation the case required, and through careful, patient inquiry, Eleanor gathered a growing body of evidence that Reginald's interpretation of the clause rested on a fundamental misreading of the original document's intent. "You have found something," Julian said one evening, watching his wife emerge from the archives with a triumphant light in her eyes that he had not seen in weeks. "I have found everything," Eleanor said, spreading a series of documents across the library table. "The clause Reginald cites was never intended to apply to direct succession at all. It refers specifically to a separate parcel of land that was sold off nearly 60 years ago, entirely unrelated to the title itself. Your grandfather's own correspondence with his solicitor at the time makes this explicitly clear, if one simply knows where to look for it." Julian examined the documents carefully, his relief visible as the full weight of Eleanor's discovery settled over him. "This is more than enough to end the challenge entirely." "Then let us end it," Eleanor said, "though I confess I would like to be present when Reginald is informed of exactly how thoroughly his claim has failed." When the matter was finally presented before the appropriate legal authorities several weeks later, Eleanor's careful research proved decisive. The ancient clause revealed clearly as irrelevant to the succession, and Reginald's challenge collapsed entirely, leaving him with nothing to show for his attempt beyond considerable legal expense and a humiliating public defeat. Julian's position, and their children's future claim to the title, stood entirely secure. It was Charlotte, now married herself to a kind and thoughtful clergyman, and expecting her own first child, who remarked afterward on the strange, satisfying symmetry of the entire episode. "Do you realize," she said to Eleanor, during a quiet visit shortly after the challenge was resolved, "that you saved the entire dukedom using precisely the qualities Mother once insisted would ruin your prospects forever? Your sharp mind, your stubborn determination to be right, your refusal to simply accept what powerful men told you was true. If you had been the quiet, agreeable woman Mother always wanted you to become, Reginald's claim might well have succeeded." Eleanor considered this for a long moment, watching her sister's gentle smile, and felt a deep, settled satisfaction spread through her chest. "I suppose there is a certain justice in that." Margaret, who had grown considerably closer to her daughters in the years since the wedding, though never entirely free of her old anxieties, was present for that conversation as well, and offered a rare, genuine laugh at Charlotte's observation. "I have long since stopped pretending I understood my own daughter as well as I believed I did. I only hope, Eleanor, that you know how proud I am now, watching what you have built, even if I was too foolish and frightened to see your worth clearly when it mattered most." "You see it now, Mother," Eleanor said. "That is enough." The birth of Eleanor and Julian's second child, a daughter they named after Julian's own mother, the botanist Duchess whose quiet intellectual pursuits had first given Eleanor hope that her own ambitions might find room within the demands of her new title, arrived without complication a few weeks later, and Eleanor found herself, in the quiet months that followed, settling into a life she could not have imagined for herself on that cold evening years earlier, when her mother's cruel words had first sent her walking alone into the dark fields behind Ashworth Manor. She continued her correspondence with scholars in the city, eventually contributing several well-regarded observations of her own to a growing body of research on estate management and agricultural practices, drawing on the careful, detailed knowledge she had gained through years of studying her own family's finances and, later, the vast holdings of the Harrogate estate. She never did attend the lectures she had once dreamed of as a girl, but she found, in time, that the life she built instead, rich with intellectual engagement, genuine partnership, and the quiet confidence of a woman who had finally learned her own worth, held its own considerable satisfactions. On the evening of her daughter's christening, Eleanor stood once again on the terrace at Harrogate Hall, much as she had on her wedding night years before, watching the last of the guests depart into the gathering dusk. Julian came to stand beside her, their young son sleeping against his shoulder, and together they looked out over the grounds of the home they had built together, a home founded not on desperation or fear, but on the simple, hard-won truth that had carried them through storms both literal and otherwise. "Your mother once stood in a room and declared, with absolute certainty, that no gentleman would ever desire you," Julian said quietly, echoing words that had once caused so much pain, and now seemed, at this great distance, almost impossible to believe had ever been spoken at all. "She did," Eleanor agreed, leaning into her husband's side, feeling the steady warmth of the life they had built together. A life shaped by honesty rather than fear, by genuine choice rather than desperate necessity. I am glad, now, that she was so completely and thoroughly wrong. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had once watched a lonely, hurting young woman sit alone on a cold stone wall, wondering whether any future worth having could possibly be waiting for her, beyond the narrow, painful expectations of the world she had been born into. That young woman could not have known, on that dark and difficult night, how far a determined man was willing to ride to prove her worth to her, nor how much strength she herself would find, in time, to prove it to herself as well.